My name is Elena, and I'm 42 years old. My life isn't remarkable, at least not in the way that draws attention. I've spent years perfecting a routine, a steady rhythm of work, solitude, and the occasional indulgence of reading in a quiet cafe. It's a life I chose, one that feels safe and predictable. But something shifted last Tuesday. I remember the date because it was so ordinary, just another midweek afternoon when I decided to stop by a cafe after running errands. The cafe was warm, the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the sweetness of pastries. I settled into my usual corner, the one by the window where I could watch people passing by, each lost in their own little worlds. That's when I saw him. He walked in with an ease that immediately drew every eye in the room, including mine. Tall, with a confidence that wasn't arrogant but natural, as though he belonged everywhere. His hair was slightly tousled, the kind of imperfection that only added to his charm. And his eyes, dark, thoughtful, lingered on everything as if he were memorizing the moment. I don't know why, but I couldn't look away. It wasn't just that he was attractive. It was the way he carried himself, the way he seemed so unaware of the effect he had on others. I busied myself with my coffee, pretending to read the book I'd brought along, but my attention kept wandering back to him. He sat a few tables away, his profile sharp against the light spilling through the window. There was a calmness about him, but also an intensity, like he was lost in a world only he could see. For a brief second, his gaze flicked in my direction. My heart leapt, a ridiculous reaction, really, but it happened all the same. I quickly looked down, my cheeks burning like I was some infatuated teenager. It's been years since I felt that kind of rush, that unbidden spark that makes your pulse quicken and your thoughts scatter. And maybe that's why, as I left the cafe that day, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment of admiration. But the next day, I found myself walking by the same cafe at the same time, hoping, without admitting it to myself, to see him again. And I did. He was there, sitting in the same spot, engrossed in his notebook. I lingered outside for a moment, pretending to browse the shop window next door, stealing glances as if I were some character in a film. He didn't see me, or if he did, he didn't let on. I followed him when he left, keeping a safe distance, my heart pounding in my chest as I watched him stroll through the park, stopping to sit on a bench and read. There was a strange comfort in observing him, like I was piecing together a puzzle, trying to understand why he'd affected me so deeply. Over the next 3 days, I couldn't stop myself. I watched as he moved through his world, noticing the way he smiled at strangers, how he lingered in bookstores and coffee shops, as if savoring the small joys of life. And all the while, I wrestled with my own thoughts. What was I doing? Why did this stranger hold such a grip on me? It wasn't rational, but then again, when is the heart ever rational? By the 4th day, I had almost convinced myself to let it go. It was ridiculous, wasn't it? A grown woman, lurking in the shadows of someone else's life like some love-struck fool. But as I walked into the cafe that morning, determined to return to my routine, the universe seemed to have other plans. He was there. This time, he wasn't alone. A friend sat across from him, their conversation animated but hushed. I told myself not to look, not to care, but my eyes betrayed me. I studied him again. The way he leaned forward, his hands gesturing as he spoke, the crinkle at the corner of his eyes when he laughed. And then it happened. Our eyes met. I froze, my hand halfway to the sugar jar. It was only for a moment, but in that fleeting second, there was something unmistakable. Recognition? Curiosity? Whatever it was, it sent a jolt through me, leaving me rooted to the spot. I quickly averted my gaze, pouring sugar into my coffee with trembling hands. My heart raced as I retreated to my usual corner, hoping to blend into the background. But I could feel it, the weight of his gaze, like a magnetic pull I couldn't resist. When I dared to glance his way again, he was still looking. Not staring, not intrusive, but something softer, like he was trying to figure me out. The next few minutes were a blur. I sipped my coffee, turned pages in my book without reading a single word, all while acutely aware of his presence. My pulse quickened every time I felt his attention shift toward me, but I pretended not to notice. Eventually, he and his friend stood to leave. My heart sank as I watched him walk away, his back disappearing into the bustling street outside. But just as I thought the moment had slipped away, he turned. It was subtle, a quick glance over his shoulder, his eyes meeting mine once more. This time, there was a smile. Small, almost imperceptible, but enough to leave me breathless. I spent the rest of the day replaying that moment in my mind, every detail etched into my memory. His smile, his glance, the way it felt like a thread had been stretched between us, invisible but undeniable. Was I imagining it? Was it just a coincidence? Or was there something more? By the time I returned home that evening, my resolve was crumbling. I couldn't deny it anymore. This wasn't just curiosity. There was something about him, something that drew me in like a moth to a flame. And for the first time in years, I felt a thrill that I thought I'd lost forever. Maybe I was a fool for chasing shadows. Or maybe, just maybe, this was fate, handing me a chance I never expected. I didn't plan to see him again so soon. After that moment in the cafe, I told myself it was better to let things be, to cherish the fleeting connection for what it was and move on. But fate, it seemed, had other ideas. The next morning, I found myself walking along the park path where I had seen him before. It wasn't intentional, or at least that's what I told myself. The autumn air was crisp, the leaves crunching underfoot, and I let the tranquility of the morning calm my restless thoughts. And then there he was. He sat on a bench beneath a canopy of golden leaves, a book open in his hands. His head was slightly bowed, his lips curled into a faint smile as he read. I paused mid-step, my heart stuttering as if it were trying to catch up with my breath. I debated walking the other way, disappearing before he noticed me. But some invisible force kept me rooted, my feet drawing me forward until I was sitting on a bench across from him, pretending to scroll through my phone. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, studying the way his fingers moved to turn the pages, the way the sunlight danced across his face. He was oblivious to my presence, or so I thought. Then it happened again. His eyes flicked up, meeting mine for a heartbeat before darting back to his book. A slow, almost shy smile curved his lips, and I felt a wave of warmth rush through me. It was so subtle, so fleeting, but in that moment, it felt as though the entire world had shifted on its axis. Over the next 2 days, I kept running into him. At the cafe, at the park, even at the little bookstore on Main Street where I sometimes wandered to clear my mind. Each time, there were these tiny moments, glances that lingered just a second too long, smiles that seemed meant for no one else but me. At first, I convinced myself it was all in my head. After all, what could he possibly see in me? I was older, quieter, a woman who had spent most of her life behind the scenes rather than in the spotlight. But the signs were undeniable. The way he positioned himself just a little closer to where I sat at the cafe, as if drawn to my presence. The way his gaze softened whenever it landed on me, filled with something I couldn't quite name. And then, the most telling moment of all, a subtle wave as we crossed paths on the park trail. It wasn't much, just a casual lift of his hand, but it spoke volumes. It told me he had noticed me too, that maybe this connection wasn't as one-sided as I had feared. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind raced with possibilities. Was this all leading somewhere, or was I reading too much into these moments? The rational part of me wanted to stay guarded, to protect myself from the ache of false hope. But my heart whispered a different story. It told me that sometimes life surprises you in the most unexpected ways. That maybe, just maybe, this was one of those moments worth taking a chance on. And for the first time in years, I decided to listen to my heart. The decision to approach him didn't come easily. For days, I wrestled with myself, torn between the fear of rejection and the longing to bridge the invisible gap between us. I was used to staying in the background, to watching life unfold without daring to interfere. But something about him made me want more connection, more courage, more life. It was a Friday afternoon when I finally gathered my resolve. He was at the cafe again, seated at his usual spot by the window. The light streamed in, catching the contours of his face, and I could almost convince myself he was waiting for someone. Waiting for me. My hands trembled as I approached his table, clutching my coffee cup like it was a lifeline. He looked up when I stopped in front of him, his dark eyes widening slightly in recognition. "Hi," I managed, my voice softer than I intended. "Do you mind if I sit here?" His smile was immediate, warm and inviting, and he gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Not at all." I don't remember the exact words we exchanged that day. Something about books, the weather, and the best coffee spots in the city. What I do remember is the way he made me feel, seen, heard, as though every word I spoke mattered. He had a way of listening that made me forget my insecurities, his eyes locked on mine with an intensity that both unnerved and thrilled me. When it was time to leave, I hesitated, my heart pounding as I fumbled for the words that had been swirling in my mind all week. I'd love to continue this conversation," I said, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "If you're free sometime, maybe you could come by my place? I make a mean cup of tea." The moment the words left my mouth, panic set in. What was I doing? Inviting a man I barely knew to my home? But his smile put me at ease, a soft curve of his lips that spoke of understanding rather than judgment. "I'd like that," he said simply. We exchanged numbers, and as I walked away, my heart felt lighter than it had in years. The days that followed were a blur of nervous anticipation. I spent hours preparing for his visit, cleaning and rearranging my home, as though it would reveal something about me that words couldn't. When the evening finally came, I was a bundle of nerves. The sound of the doorbell sent a jolt through me, and I took a deep breath before opening the door to find him standing there, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. "For you," he said, his voice as warm as his smile. I accepted the flowers with a shy laugh, stepping aside to let him in. As he crossed the threshold, I realized this wasn't just a meeting. It was a leap of faith, a step into the unknown, guided by nothing more than the hope that this connection was real. And in that moment, as the door closed behind him, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in years, I was ready to let someone in. As he stepped into my home, I was acutely aware of every detail, the soft lighting, the subtle scent of lavender lingering in the air, the silence that felt so different with him here. I led him to the living room, where a small table sat between us, and the dim glow of the evening cast a warmth over everything. He took a seat, his movements fluid and easy, as though he had belonged here all along. We exchanged another smile, and for a moment, I forgot to breathe. The nervous fluttering in my stomach was almost overwhelming, but there was something comforting in his presence, as if everything was happening as it should. I poured the tea, my hands trembling just slightly as I set the cup before him. He took it with a quiet thanks, and we both sat there for a while, letting the silence speak for us. It was strange, but in that silence, there was a kind of intimacy that words could never capture. I studied him, how his eyes flicked to the window as he took a sip, how the corners of his mouth curled slightly as he looked at me again, his gaze lingering just a bit longer than I expected. The tension in the room wasn't uncomfortable. Rather, it was the kind of tension that builds before something extraordinary happens. "I'm glad you came," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "I'm glad you invited me," he replied, and there was something in his tone that made my heart race. It wasn't just politeness. It was genuine. The conversation flowed slowly at first, as though we were testing the waters. He told me about his studies, his dreams, and the little things that filled his days. I listened, hanging on to every word, wanting to know everything about him, while at the same time, terrified of what I might discover. Then, without warning, he set his cup down and shifted in his seat. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded, my heart thudding in my chest. "What made you invite me here tonight?" The question caught me off guard. For a moment, I didn't know how to answer. The truth felt too raw, too vulnerable to admit. But something in his eyes made me feel safe, safe enough to share my heart, even if it was just for this fleeting moment. "I don't know," I said softly. Maybe I wanted to see if what I felt was real. All this time, I've been watching you from a distance, and it felt like something I couldn't ignore. It's not rational, but I trailed off, feeling the weight of my own words. He was silent for a long moment, and I wondered if I had said too much. But then, with a quiet smile, he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. The touch was gentle, almost hesitant, as though he were afraid of breaking the delicate moment between us. "I think you're brave," he said softly, his voice low and full of meaning. "Not many people would be this honest. And not many people would take the risk to let someone in." I felt my breath catch in my throat. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for, the moment where the distance between us would finally vanish, and I could no longer deny the connection that had been growing between us for days. But instead of closing the gap, I hesitated. My mind raced, my insecurities creeping up once more. Was I doing the right thing? Was this foolish? Before I could second-guess myself, he leaned in, his hand resting on mine with a tenderness that stole the breath from my lungs. Our eyes locked, and in that moment, all the doubts, all the fears, seemed to fade away. "I've been wanting this too," he whispered. "I just didn't know if you felt the same." And just like that, the space between us closed. His lips found mine in a kiss that was soft at first, tentative, as if we were both savoring the moment, letting the electricity between us build. Then, as though a dam had burst, the kiss deepened, more urgent now, as if the world around us had suddenly fallen away. I had no words, no thoughts, only the sensation of his lips, his warmth, his presence overwhelming me in the best way. This was real. This connection, this bond, it wasn't just a fleeting spark. It was something that had been building for days, and now it was here, alive and undeniable. When we finally pulled back, breathless, he rested his forehead against mine, his voice a soft murmur in the quiet room. I've never felt anything like this before. Neither had I. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions I wasn't prepared for. His presence in my life, once a distant thought, was now a constant, a warmth that I couldn't seem to escape. We spent hours together, talking, laughing, and discovering parts of each other that felt both familiar and foreign. It was like learning to dance, slow, tentative steps at first, and then a rhythm that seemed to flow naturally between us. But with every shared moment, a lingering question haunted me. What did this mean? What was I doing? The age between us was more than just a number. It was a silent barrier I couldn't ignore. I tried to push it aside, to let the connection we shared define us rather than the years that separated us. But the doubts kept creeping in, whispering in the quiet moments when we weren't together. What would people say? How would we ever make it work in a world that expected certain things from us? One evening, after dinner at my place, he sat next to me on the couch, his hand resting casually on mine. The comfort between us was almost overwhelming, yet in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the fear. I turned to face him, my fingers nervously tracing the edge of his hand. "You've been quiet tonight," he remarked, his voice soft but perceptive. "What's on your mind?" I hesitated, unsure of how to voice the swirling emotions that seemed to threaten to consume me. "I've been thinking about us," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "About how unexpected this is. About how different we are." He turned to me, his eyes filled with understanding. "Different how?" "The age," I said, almost as if I were speaking to myself. "The way people might look at us. The way I'm not sure if I'm doing the right thing. I've lived my life one way, and now I trailed off, my throat tightening. I don't know what this is, or where it's going, or what it means for us." He was silent for a moment, and I felt a pang of regret for bringing it up, for letting my worries cast a shadow over what had been so beautiful. But then, with a tenderness that made my heart ache, he took my hands in his. "Do you think I care about any of that?" he asked, his voice steady, unshaken. "I'm not here because of age, or because of some checklist. I'm here because of you, because of how you make me feel, how you've made me feel since the first time I saw you. What matters to me is us, right now." His words hit me like a wave, washing over the doubts and fears I had carried with me. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just looked at him, searching his face for any sign that he was saying what he thought I wanted to hear. But there was nothing but truth in his eyes. I don't know where this will go either, he continued, his thumb brushing over my skin. But I do know that I'm not willing to let it go just because it's complicated. And in that moment, I realized that the fear I had been holding onto wasn't mine alone. It was the weight of societal expectations, of the voices that told me love had boundaries, that there were lines I couldn't cross. But as I sat there, looking into his eyes, I knew that I was ready to ignore those voices. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was risky. But for the first time in a long while, I felt something more powerful than fear. Hope. I took a deep breath, letting go of the tension I hadn't realized I was holding. Then let's see where it takes us, I said, my voice steady now, filled with the certainty that this was the right thing for us, no matter what anyone else thought. His smile was the answer I needed, and as I leaned in to kiss him again, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. The days following that conversation felt like a fresh start, like the world had opened up in ways I hadn't thought possible. We weren't just two people from different walks of life anymore. We were a team. His presence became my anchor, steadying me in ways I never anticipated. There was no hesitation when we were together, no second-guessing, no room for doubt. We simply existed, in the moment, entwined in something pure and undeniable. I began to lose myself in him. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't mind. There was a freedom in the way he loved me, without judgment, without the weight of the world on his shoulders. He didn't see my age or the years I had lived before him. He saw me, just me, and for that, I would never be able to repay him. We spent our time exploring the city together, the streets we had both walked 1,000 times suddenly feeling different with him by my side. The café where we first met became our place, where we shared more than just coffee. It was where our hearts began to open, where we learned each other's secrets, our fears, our dreams. The park where I had watched him from afar now held memories of stolen kisses and quiet moments beneath the trees. But as much as I reveled in our time together, I couldn't ignore the outside world. The whispers were there, always lingering in the back of my mind. I heard them when we walked through the market, or when we sat in public hand in hand. The looks, the whispers, those unspoken judgments that followed us wherever we went. One afternoon, while we sat at a small café, he reached across the table, his thumb grazing over my hand. I felt his gaze on me, tender yet filled with concern. "You're quiet," he said softly. "What's going on in that mind of yours?" I let out a deep breath, feeling the weight of the unspoken thoughts. "It's the world," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "The way people look at us. They don't understand. And sometimes, I wonder if I'm too old for this. For us. If I'm dragging you into something that's only going to bring us pain." His expression softened, and he squeezed my hand, the warmth of his touch sending a ripple of comfort through me. "We can't control what other people think," he said, his voice steady and sure. "But we can control what we feel. And what I feel, I know this is real. I don't care what anyone else thinks. I care about you." His words, as simple as they were, hit me with the force of a revelation. In that moment, I realized something I had been too afraid to admit to myself. The only opinion that mattered was mine. And I wanted this. I wanted him. The fear that had held me back for so long, the fear of judgment, of loss, of time running out, slowly began to fade. I leaned in, brushing my lips against his, a soft kiss that spoke volumes. And in that kiss, I knew that no matter the obstacles, no matter the judgments or the challenges we might face, this love was worth it. It was worth fighting for. "I'm not afraid anymore," I whispered against his lips. His smile, wide and full of relief, made my heart race. "Then let's not waste another moment." And from that moment on, there was no looking back. We were no longer confined by what the world expected of us. We were free to love, to explore, to embrace the beauty of the unexpected. Our love wasn't a story of defiance or rebellion. It was simply a love story, pure and undeniable. It wasn't about age or time. It was about two souls that had found each other against all odds, and I couldn't have been more grateful for that chance encounter. It's funny how the most profound moments can pass so quietly, without any dramatic fanfare or grand gestures. Our love, though intense and filled with passion, didn't need the noise. It was in the simple things, a quiet touch, a shared laugh, the way our hands always seemed to find each other. It wasn't about making a statement to the world, it was about making a statement to ourselves. In the months that followed, we grew closer in ways I hadn't anticipated. There were still moments of doubt, times when I would catch myself wondering if this was all too much, if the world would ever accept us. But every time those thoughts crept in, I would look at him, and the doubt would dissolve. His eyes, always steady and full of understanding, would remind me that this was worth every fear, every risk, every second. We learned to navigate the complexities of our relationship, his youth, my experience, without letting them define us. We didn't need to explain ourselves to anyone. The connection we shared was enough. It was in the way we communicated without words, the way he would quietly hold me when I was lost in my thoughts, or how I would kiss him with a tenderness that made time stand still. It was love, in its most honest and purest form, untouched by the expectations of others. As time went on, I realized that this relationship had given me something I hadn't known I'd lost, a sense of self. With him, I was not just a woman with years behind her. I was a woman full of possibility, of passion, of dreams. I had rediscovered parts of myself I thought were long gone, and for that, I was grateful. We took each day as it came, savoring every moment. There were no guarantees, no promises of forever, but we didn't need them. What we had was real, and that was enough. I often find myself reflecting on how it all began. The quiet days of watching him from afar, the tentative steps we took towards one another, and the moments of connection that followed. I had been afraid, unsure of what would come next, but I had never expected this. I had never expected to fall so deeply, to rediscover myself in the process. Love doesn't follow a script. It doesn't obey rules or timelines. It simply is. It finds us when we least expect it, and it teaches us to be brave, to take the leap, to follow our hearts, even when the world tells us it's not the right time or the right person. And in the end, I realized that love, true love, isn't about age or circumstances. It's about two souls meeting, connecting, and choosing each other every day. So here we are, two people who once thought love had passed them by, now rediscovering it in a way that feels more alive than anything I ever imagined. And for the first time in a long time, I am at peace with where I am, with who I am, and with who I am with. In the quiet moments, when it's just the two of us, I know this. Love is always worth the risk. It's worth the vulnerability, the doubt, and the courage it takes to step into the unknown. Because in the end, love is what makes us whole. And no matter what the world thinks, we are enough.